all of us have to figure out how do we explain, and there are a number of ways to explain those. As a non-Christian, I held to several of these possible explanations, and we've been looking at those first before we turn a corner and finally look at the Christian explanation. So let us continue now with, we've looked at, were they wrong about him being dead, Jesus being dead on the cross? We looked at, were they lying and formed a conspiracy to tell a fabrication about Jesus? We looked at whether or not they had hallucinated this and were delusional. And we looked at whether they had been fooled by an imposter. And today, we're going to look at the fifth explanation offered by non-Christians related to the resurrection. And that is whether or not they were influenced in some way. I mean, influenced in some way by perhaps somebody who imagined seeing Jesus, but was so influential within the group that the one person, now you can see why this might be a better way to approach this if you're trying to explain. As a matter of fact, this explanation is a relatively new way. I think it's really Bart Ehrman I've seen who starts off looking at this example, looking at this particular explanation for the resurrection appearances. So instead of saying, hey, you've got groups, and I think people recognize that if we're saying that entire groups hallucinated the resurrection, that's a harder sell. It's harder to explain how you can have group dreams or group hallucinations. But what if only one person hallucinated this? We're kind of back to what we talked about in that session about were they delusional, were they hallucinating, where we talked about, hey, if one person wanted it bad enough, they might imagine something that's not true. And what if that one person happened to be in a position of influence so that they could communicate a truth to the group in a way that was so persuasive that they persuaded others? Now, I'm just going to say up front that this approach does have problems, right? Because you know that the record does not indicate that anyone says, oh, hey, so-and-so said they saw the risen Christ. And then we all, were so encouraged that so-and-so said they saw the risen Christ. I mean, it's not a story about a so-and-so who saw the risen Christ. Instead, it's a story about a group in different settings, different numbers of people, and different situations who see the risen Christ. So already, this kind of claim does not kind of jive with the biblical record. But you can see why it might be powerful, because at least it eliminates the problem you have when you're suggesting that entire groups imagined the same thing. But my question, of course, is of this group that were so glad to see the risen Christ, tell me, who is it that is so influential that they can persuade everyone of something that's not true? Is it Mary? And I only offer Mary first because remember, Mary is the one who, at least Mary Magdalene, or it's the women at the tomb, for example, who are the first observers. Is it one of these? These are the people in the biblical record who seem to see Jesus first. But it seems to me also they're not influential enough to even convince the disciples, because they initially hear this news and want to rush to confirm it because they don't believe it. I don't know that even if someone like this did see, there's only one person who ever saw the risen Christ, that this person, that one of the women at the tomb would have been influential enough to influence the others to believe it. So then we look at other people who are in this, people like Peter. He would be the first disciple or the first of the apostles, the future apostles, maybe, who would say he is either encounters the risen Christ or at least the empty tomb. My question, though, is then what does he do then? The record says that Mary saw Jesus first. Is Peter able to say to Mary, hey, I saw the risen Christ and you did too, only you saw him before me? I mean, how do you convince someone? It's one thing to convince somebody that you saw something, but are you influential enough to convince the other person that their entire historical account of how they saw that somebody is an invention that you persuaded them to believe? And I just don't know who in this group could see this and then in retrospect convince the others of a sequential timeline, right? This is why the early dating of scripture is so important, because it turns out that if the scriptures are written early, those accounts then should reflect the fact that really one person sees this, or we should be able to trace all of these accounts through that one person. And there is the problem. We can't do that from the biblical accounts. Look, you discover this when you're investigating homicides or any other crime, where you've got people who allegedly are the kind of the ringleader, the person who is they're the brain trust, the person who decided how to do this crime, decided when to do the crime. They're the kind of the brains behind the crime. When you interview them, you get a very different story than you get when you interview the other people who are secondary members of the gang. Here's what I mean. Let's say, for example, we have some imaginary vision. And let's say you convinced everybody that they all had the vision together. You're so influential. Okay, well, my point would be that if you were to ask the person who is the ringleader, the person who actually had the delusion, had the hallucination personally, well, if you ask that person for details, like if you ask a ringleader, hey, so what happened on the day? And he's making this stuff up, right? Well, the details he can offer are extremely articulate and detailed because this is the thing that's coming out of his mind. The person who has the delusion or the hallucination can, if you had a dream, you can recall it in great detail. And you might tell me the dream later, but if I interview the person who has been told the dream or told the hallucination, and I ask for details from that person, remember, you're not the actual person who had the dream. The person who has the dream can give you every little detail because they're returning to their mind's eye. Because if they saw something in history, even, they can return to their mind's eye. But if the other person didn't also have his own vision of this or his own historical encounter with Jesus, when pressed for details, his responses are much fuzzier. Why? Because he is not the source of the hallucination in this case. He's just the repeater but here's the problem you have. Over and over again in the biblical record, you have repeated descriptions of encounters with Jesus, all that are articulate and detailed and involve a number of different people in different settings. That's the problem, is this is not the kind of thing you can trace and say, well, no wonder she says less. She didn't actually have the vision. Only one person had it. They just convinced the others. And also remember, if you wanted to falsify this, it wouldn't be hard, right? You would simply run to the tomb, because if all of this is just the hallucination coming from one even influential person, the tomb shouldn't be empty. And this is why people who hold this view have to reject the empty tomb, because they know the empty tomb is the deal killer. So is this a possibility? Yeah, it's like anything else. It's a more recent kind of explanation for the biblical account, but it's not reasonable for all the reasons I've already discussed. Now, I held largely, as the atheist that I held to this sixth explanation, that they were in fact just legends that grew over time. The entire empty tomb account, the entire resurrection and the ascension were just part of the Jesus story, the simple Jesus who eventually became the Christ of Christianity because of exaggerations and modifications and distortions that occur for several years following all of this nonsense. Now, look, I could go through the entire thing again with you, but if you remember from the earlier sessions we did on the reliability of the Bible, we talked about the dating and the change of the scriptures over time. Because in order to be a kind of a late legend, you would need to be two things. You need to be late and a legend. And there's the problem. And we've already covered this. So go back to that session, those sessions where we talked about the early dating. The early dating, this is happening too early, because whatever you're saying about Jesus, it's happening early enough that it's being written about and discussed and communicated by Luke and that his gospel is being used by Paul. And this is happening too early. If it's happening early enough that those who would know something different would be able to say something. So it's not a late legend in the sense that it's not written late. It's easier, of course, to lie about somebody if you simply wait till everyone knows the truth is dead. So it's not late, and it has to be late in order to be a late legend. And we also know there's nothing legendary in it, in the sense that there's nothing additional to the story that is added over time. That's how legends actually develop, right? They develop because slight modifications that amplify the story are added over time. And that's not what we're seeing here in the story of the resurrection. It's early. It's very early. The first accounts of Jesus include the resurrection account. The first people who are in the students of the eyewitnesses are already repeating the resurrection. People like this is the chain of custody from Peter, which we also just briefly talked about. This is in the book Cold Case Christianity. Okay, so all of this being said, is it possible that this is a late legend? Now, look, I would say, just for sake of argument, Sure, it's possible. I actually don't think there's any way. It's so easy to date and examine the nature of the Jesus story over time that I think you could only say this is possible for sake of argument, but it's certainly not reasonable. I don't even think you could say this one's possible, but it's certainly not reasonable. This is not a late legend because it's neither late nor is it legendary. So there you have it. We've now examined all six, and today we did two of them. Were they influenced by one person who had an hallucination and was influential with the group, and are they late legends or developments over time? And I think you can see from both of those, that's explanation 5 and explanation 6, from a secular perspective, from a non-Christian perspective, from a supernatural, from a philosophically natural perspective. I've now given you the 6 explanations that are typically offered.